We surveyed a large portion of our audience and wanted to see how they feel about politics. And it was a bit grim, the responses. So 89% said that they didn't feel inspired, and 93% said they didn't feel represented. Why do you think so many people don't feel like they belong or care about Australian politics?
Oh, look, I think they do care, but take a look at the parliament. It's full of pale, male, and stale dudes and people who are earning more than they should. There's not enough young people in politics. I'm really proud that the Greens have quite a few young people elected, but I mean, even we should have more. We've got one of the youngest members of parliament in the ACT parliament. A lot of our lower house members, and also Jordan Steele-Jong and Sarah, were real groundbreakers when they were elected in their 20s. But I think young people look at Parliament and they see a bunch of old fogies that don't look like them or sound like them and don't understand the concerns of younger people. And when I talk to younger people, it's climate, it's affordable housing, and it's the fact that they just don't know where they belong in the world because everything's in flux at the moment. There's no funding for mental health programs. There's no funding for sexual health services. There's not enough funding going to women fleeing violence, which is an issue that young people really care about. So I think young people, and I sound like an old fart even saying young people, but I think younger people actually care about real issues, and they're not seeing Parliament deal with the real issues, and that's because it's not. It should be dealing with climate change. It should be dealing with affordable housing. It should be dealing with sexual harassment and violence against women. And we should be getting more young people into Parliament. And at the minute, the Parliament's not really doing those things. And so it's no surprise that young people think that's not really for me. But unfortunately, the Parliament does in fact shape the experience of a lot of young people's lives. And like I said before, we could be funding mental health. We could be making sure that young people can vote from the age of 16 if they want to, like many young people do. We could be making sure that we actually freeze rents. And last night's budget was a real opportunity to do that, and they did basically nothing. So I think we really need more young people in this place so that we can start addressing the issues that are actually real to young people and real to so many other ordinary people.
Well, speaking of getting young people into the actual political system itself, when we did the survey, but we also went out to some university students to ask them basically how they felt. Again, it was pretty grim. But something that was interesting that one of the students said was that they felt that they actually couldn't afford to do that because they're too worried about the HECS debt, rental stuff, trying to find groceries and everything else, where they felt like they actually couldn't afford to run a campaign.
Yeah.
I suppose, what do you say to that? And to another extent, how can we get more of those young people into politics, especially through grassroots systems, if they don't feel represented by the major parties?
Yeah, well, we're totally right that we're in a cost of living crisis and it's hitting young people really hard. And most students, if they can afford to take on a HECS debt to go to uni or TAFE, most people are juggling 3 or 4 jobs to try to just pay the rent if they've been lucky to find somewhere to rent. So I'm not surprised that people feel like they can't afford to run for politics, but what an indictment on our political system that you've got to have money in order to put your hand up to run. Like, we are not America. It shouldn't just be you've got to be rich in order to run for parliament. So we do need to change that perception and that reality. And it is pretty hard to run as an independent. And I think it's great that we have independence in Parliament, so I think people should still consider that an option. But those barriers are real. The Greens try to make sure that we pre-select younger people, women, people from diverse backgrounds. Like, we're actively trying to make sure that our candidates look like the rest of the community and come from the community and can represent the community. So I would say to young people, if you care about the climate crisis, if you want to do something about the cost of living and the price of housing, well, the Greens would love to have you. And I'm really proud we've just pre-selected a teenager to run for us in one of our state seats in Queensland. We've got the youngest member in the ACT Parliament. I think she's 24. So, like, we love young people and we actually want to give young people a platform. And stuff like the student strikes that have been happening, it's dynamite. When young people are so pissed off at the system that they mobilise and take it on like that and hit the streets, that just gives me hope and makes my heart sing, because I think the old fogies in this place ignore that at their own peril. And I think the student strikes are really powerful. And it shows that the decision makers are not reflecting the will of young people if they've had to take to the streets to be heard. So I'm really proud that young people are using their voice and speaking up, and we need our systems to encourage that. So lowering the voting age is definitely an important thing that could help with that. Getting more young people elected will help with that. And like I say, the Greens are really trying to do that, and we've had some success. And just actually tackling the issues that are shaping young people's lives rather than just delivering for billionaires and big corporations like governments always seem to do, no matter what colour they are.
Speaking of the student strikes, obviously there's been a lot going on, but on the climate front, there was the school strike for climate. Obviously, because young people are incredibly passionate about the climate and it's going to affect our future and it's affecting our present. And when we spoke to the Minister for Climate Change, he basically he did say that the strikes didn't really impact his decision-making or the government's decision-making. What do you kind of make of that statement?
I can't believe he said the quiet part out loud, and I'm embarrassed that any politician would say that they don't care if people are rioting on the streets. They don't need that input. They've already made up their mind. I think that shows that unfortunately, the current government are not prepared to listen to young people and not prepared to listen to ordinary people. And you know what it says? It says they're actually listening to the donors from the fossil fuel companies that fund their re-election campaigns. And I'm heartbroken that the current government, who said they'd be better and who said they'd be different from the last mob, who were atrocious, I'm heartbroken that they're not better on climate, because it's what people want. It's what the earth needs. And I just think I cannot believe that donations from coal companies and gas companies buys them the access and the outcomes that they get. I think that's revolting. It's legalised bribery. And we've been trying to fix that for years. And the other parties don't want to turn off the tap of their political donors. They want to keep taking that money and keep buying themselves seats in Parliament. But it's no surprise that the number of non-major parties in the Parliament is growing, because people are sick of their politicians being for sale. They want actual representation. They want community members. They want young people. They want people that look like the rest of the community to be in Parliament. And I think if the two big parties just keep doing the bidding of the coal and gas companies, not only will they stuff up the climate for all of us, but I think their vote will continue to go down. And that's their choice. The climate doesn't care who's in charge. It just wants us to stop opening new coal and gas mines. And I really thought we might see that from this government, and I'm deeply disappointed that they're still opening new coal and gas mines in 2024 when we're in a fucking climate crisis.
It's kind of the sentiment that we felt from the audience when they were responding, especially with saying that they felt very hopeless or disappointed in Albanese and Labor government because it was an election of promise. And we kind of posed them a question of Prime Minister between Albanese and Dutton. And basically everyone was saying that they're disappointed in Albanese and they're terrified of Dutton.
Yeah.
How do you think we can better educate people and raise awareness of that there's more than just two parties, that there are minor parties, there's independents, and there's a way to vote without having to put your words and votes behind those people?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think more and more young people are realising they don't have to choose between the Coles and Woolworths of Australian politics. And it is getting harder to tell the difference between Albanese and Scott Morrison's Liberals, who is now Peter Dutton's Liberals. I share their terror that that man might be our next Prime Minister. But when there's getting harder and harder to see a policy difference, I don't understand why the Labor Party don't actually realise that people voted for something different and they wanted a policy change. They didn't just want a different coloured tie. They wanted meaningful change. And the Greens are here. And we're in the balance of power in the Senate, and we've got 4 people in the House of Representatives, so we share the balance of power there too. And we will fight for climate action. We will fight for young people. We'll fight for housing for everyone. We'll fight for equality. And I really encourage young people to have a bit of a look at what we stand for. And I think they'll find that they like what they hear, because we get our members to write our policies, and a lot of our members are young people. So, we stand at the ready, and our support's growing. We're the biggest third party in the Parliament, and we don't take those dodgy donations from coal and gas companies, and we don't spout bullshit like the other parties.
Do you think that come the next election, our generation will provide a very important voting bloc, especially if so many of us are fed up with politics as usual and being gaslit and lied to. Do you think there will be a very big uptick in more independents and Greens on top of the last election, which already was a very big uptick in Greens and independent votes?
I really do. I think young people will decide the outcome of the next election. And so they've got a really powerful role to play in sending a message that, sure, we don't want Dutton, agree he'd be terrifying, but they're deeply let down and betrayed by the Labor Party, who said they'd be different from the Liberals and then spend all their time agreeing with the Liberals. It's super weird and like totally uninspirational. So I understand why young people are scratching their heads and thinking that politics isn't for them. But actually young people are really powerful and they can determine who forms government. And more young people are backing the Greens because we listen to them and we fight for their future. And I would hope that young people can get on the roll and can see that they can help change the system. Like nothing changes if nothing changes, but we stand ready to fight for a better future for everyone. And yeah, we hope that young people can continue to back us to do that and get involved.
Yeah, and switching gears a bit, in the response we asked our audience to list the things that they're deeply concerned about, and a large portion, well, 73% of people put down women's safety and ending violence against women. And we spoke to Amanda Greavy, who's a general manager at Lou's Place, which is a crisis centre in Sydney that provides support and services to women in need, especially those leaving violence. And she said that something that concerns her is that the Prime Minister says he wants to do a royal commission, but that will take years. And we already know what works, especially when we have domestic violence plans and strategies that clearly aren't working enough. And we have 28 women that have been killed as of today. And what do you think the Labor government should be doing to help these women and to kind of help this crisis?
Well, Kai, that's the reason I was a little bit late for our interview. I was just doing a press conference about violence against women and what the government should do. So great question. And I love that young people have this on their radar. I'm not surprised because unfortunately a lot of young women in particular are being sexually assaulted. And we still need better consent laws and better education about what consent is and that it's active and ongoing, and that young boys need to learn that as well as young women. So I'm really pleased and I'm not surprised that's on the radar of young people because unfortunately the rates of harassment are highest between women aged 15 to 19, including in the workplace, which is foul because a lot of those people are a lot older, those employers that are creeping on their younger employees. So it's a real power imbalance. And so we've helped to fix the laws on sexual harassment at work, and we've said now that employers and bosses have to take positive steps to prevent harassment at work. But the numbers don't lie. It's still a massive problem. And on violence against women in particular, the person that you talk to who runs that refuge and that support service, they're like so many others around the country that don't have enough money to help everyone that reaches out for their help. And we just heard the Women's Legal Service last week say they're turning away 1,000 women a week because they don't have the money to help them. And like, what the hell is happening in this country where they just found $50 billion to give to coal and gas companies, but they're too poor to give money to frontline services? Like, seriously, I can't believe that there's been 28 women killed this year, which is almost twice what we had compared to last year. And like, they called the National Cabinet about it and everything. And all we got was a rehashing of a Scott Morrison policy about an escaping violence payment, which is fine, you know, give them the money, but it's not enough when you're not funding the services that people need help from. So we're in a crisis of funding frontline services, and there was not a single cent for that in the budget last night. And then they had the audacity to re-announce for the third time the same amount of money for housing that we got, the Greens got, out of our negotiations on a housing bill last year. So they're trying to kid people that they're taking this seriously, but we see straight through it. And I'm genuinely floored that they can't realise that the community, including young people, want the government to take serious action on violence against women, and that involves funding the services that help people when they flee violence, and that when 28 people have been killed, women, this year already, we're in a national emergency, and they're just not treating it like that, and they're not funding it like that. And I don't know what more it's going to take. Like, the ingredients were there. Women voted for the change of government, and women really expected better from this government, and like, they feel betrayed that they're not getting what they voted for. The government's not doing what it said on the tin. So let's get a different tin and not a Dutton tin.
Speaking to my friends, it feels like we're always having these conversations, and especially a lot of my friends are female, and a lot of the times they feel unsafe to go anywhere or do anything. And with the recent, especially in Sydney, the Bondi attacks, now they feel like they can't even do anything. And there's a real sense of hopelessness that our generation feel as a whole on certain levels, and now even more so women who feel like they can't do anything without feeling any form of protection. And you were mentioning about the budget being a betrayal for a government that says it's for women.
Yeah.
And as you said before, there were no new money for frontline families. What would you have hoped the budget included to make, my friends and make women across Australia feel safe and supported?
Yeah, well, I mean, cultural change is what we need so that we have less murder and less violence against women, less assault at every level. We know that gender inequality is what's driving this epidemic. There's a whole lot of other things as well, but that's one of the key drivers. So we need education about that. We need those respectful relationships programs that are already in schools, but they're really lumpy in their funding and they're delivered really poorly by overworked, underpaid teachers who actually need to be better supported to deliver that material. So what could have happened last night in a budget that actually dealt with women's safety is proper funding, so those respectful relationships education programs can be really well delivered by experts, well resourced in schools. What could have happened would be funding for men's behaviour change programs, once you've left school to reach to reach grown-ups. What could have happened would be funding for prevention programs, like nationwide education programs about equality, and not stupid ones like milkshakes. I don't know if your audience remembers those really ridiculous milkshake ads at the last government. Yeah, like not that, but some kind of effective national campaign that's actually written by young people so that young people hear that message and that it's drafted for them. And you might also remember they gave some money to universities to do that, and then the universities totally didn't do it. They used it for a different purpose. And we had a whole Senate inquiry exposing that. But they had like peer-designed, student-led consent education that the vice-chancellors, the old crusties, said, oh, that's too risque, and they watered it down, and then they turned it into some training manual for staff. That's important too, but it shouldn't replace young people drafting education material to help stop violence against women. All of those things could have happened, and full funding for frontline services so that when people, because cultural change is going to take a while, so that when people actually have the guts and the means to leave violence, they can be supported. And they could have announced new money for housing, so that people have somewhere to go when they leave violence, because that's what's keeping women in violence. There's literally nowhere to go. No one can afford a home. There's no private rentals left, and the wait list for social housing is like 2 years plus. They could have done all of that, and they did absolutely none of that, and I don't understand why.
Speaking to my friends again and having those conversations with them, and it feels like they feel very isolated and kind of confused, and almost at the point where now it feels like a joke to a lot of us, because we saw this happening and we see the potential things that can be done and they don't happen. And like the $5,000 payment to eligible women, but then what does that look like? And then there's some rental assistance. Yeah, and there's some rental assistance, but then what about women who are living in cars and don't have that? And then again, when the Prime Minister made comments on April 28 outside of Parliament House and made the young woman who set up the entire thing cry.
And still hasn't apologised to Sarah Williams.
Yeah, and then says, I'm the Prime Minister. What did you make of that moment, and what did that tell you about how this government is treating women?
Yeah, I think that was not the Prime Minister's finest moment. And if I were him, I would have apologised to her immediately or at any time since. But he's just hoping that people forget about that. Women don't forget about how men treat us. And I was really shocked that he didn't see that he'd done wrong in that situation and apologise for it. I don't understand what was going on in his brain, because the rally organisers had said, here are our 5 demands. if you want to commit to those things, by all means, come and speak and tell us how you've committed to those 5 things. Otherwise, we don't want to hear your spiel because it's not good enough. And then they hadn't committed to those 5 asks, including a declaration of a national emergency, which I've lodged a motion in federal parliament saying we're in a national emergency of violence against women. So, like, not a hard thing to do, but the Prime Minister still didn't do it. And then he barged on into the microphone anyway. And I just think it was very ironic when at a rally about women's safety and respecting women, the Prime Minister really missed the memo about respecting the women at that rally. I think it was just a very poor judgment. And then they haven't coughed up anything in last night's budget. So maybe they're just thinking that this is some political issue, but this is life and death, and this is young people, young women feeling unsafe most of the time, no matter where they are. And that is appalling. And I agree, like, as a woman, I feel unsafe a lot of the time too. And like when women are being killed going for a run or going to the bloody shops, like, we know we're not safe at night, but at the shops or going for a run, like, this is at obscene levels now, and we need governments to put their shoulders to the wheel on this and like fund those behaviour change programs, fund those education programs, fund those frontline support services. Because something's going wrong, and young people are getting their messages from Andrew Tate, and we need messaging that counteracts that, written by young people, designed for young people. That's the only thing that's going to work, not some weird algorithm designed by a bunch of old people in a room that will inevitably fail.
I think you can see that as well with people feeling very inspired by people like Chanel Contos and Sarah Williams and people like that who are our age, look like us and speak the way we do, and kind of hold this truth to power. And I think that's as well as another point of what we were finding in our survey was that a lot of young people just felt like, well, why am I going to engage in something that I don't see myself in? Yeah. And I mean, we had even responses of people saying that Albanese's a wolf in sheep's clothing, and then Dutton's just a wolf.
That's right. He doesn't even bother with the sheep disguise.
Yeah, and that it feels like sometimes it can feel like this parliament is against us a lot of the ways. And I suppose I'd want to know, especially in your experience, how do you make sure that we can feel hopeful for the future, especially with so much going on with HEX and the climate crisis and rental crisis and housing crisis, cost of living, and I can go on and on about all sorts of things. And how do you think that we can feel supported and then also feel hopeful to make those changes?
Such a wonderful question, because it's a really shit time right now for young people and for anyone with a heart. I mean, look at the world where, you know, there's wars going on everywhere, there's genocide being perpetrated, there's conflict, there's inequality, there's murder of women, there's an impossible cost of living crisis, there's no chance for a home, the climate's fucked. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear. The climate's in ruins. So I understand that people feel really depressed about the future, but it doesn't have to be this way. Like, politics doesn't have to just entrench the status quo. We can actually change that. Last night's budget, like, that could have been a chance. The government of the day could have said, yes, we're going to actually make sure everyone's got a roof over their heads because we're a wealthy country, we can afford that. No, we're not going to spend billions on nuclear submarines and fossil fuel subsidies. We're going to back renewables. We're going to make sure, as I said, everyone's got a house. We could have put dental and mental into Medicare so that people could actually afford to go to the dentist, and equally importantly, people could actually get some early intervention to help them deal with the crisis that the world's in. They're all choices that could be made differently. So things can change, and with pressure on the big parties in the form of votes against them, that's unfortunately the only thing they listen to. They listen to headlines and they listen to where the votes go. You know, only the media moguls are in charge of the headlines, but young people are in charge of where their votes go. And with the growing surge in Green support from young people, the government's getting nervous, and that'll be their choice. Do they continue to ignore young people and just be like the other party and lose government? Greens are ready. Like, we'll be in government eventually, and we'll tackle the climate crisis. We'll make sure everyone's got a roof over their heads, and we'll tackle gender inequality and fund frontline services and education programs. So it can be different. Politics can deliver change. We just need more gutsy people in there to do it, and we need more young people in there to help do that.
I was going to end on a hopeful note, but you mentioned Medicare, and quickly we did another call out about how Medicare was basically ruining people's lives. And because I had my own experience with it when I had injured my ankle. And there were so many horrific stories from people having to skip things or take medicine that they didn't know about. Or there was one person who took their dog's antibiotics because they couldn't go to the hospital. There's someone that with dental, they just ripped their tooth out, and just like all these things that were happening. And I think that adds to when we read these things and when we're living out these experiences, it can feel really tough to feel like there's anyone there. So it's nice to hear that there's at least some people in some formation. I think we're really resilient as our generation, especially that's what we see in all the strikes that we're always at. And even in the university strikes, I don't think they've ever really been on the wrong side of history. And I think that there's a lot of power amongst us, but it can feel hard, especially in times like this, to kind of have that spark to feel that way. So, but hopefully young people and I mean, we can use that in our voting and be able to feel empowered to do that stuff.
Yeah, I think young people are taking over, as they should, and governments will ignore them at their own peril. And like young people get it right. You want climate action, you want equality, you want housing, you want university to be free and education to be free as it should be. And that's what the Greens think as well. So we are proud to represent the values of most young people. And yeah, we'll fight for a better future, because until we can get more young people into Parliament and get that voting age lowered to 16, then we've got to work with what we've got at the moment. It is hard to find hope when everything feels hopeless, but young people are powerful. They'll decide who wins government next time around, and more people are not voting for the Labor and Liberal parties, and that's how change will happen.